When the word terrorist is mentioned, there's one image that primarily comes to mind: a Muslim. In fact, the vast majority of global violence is not committed by Muslims. The vast majority of Muslims aren't involved in any militant activity. And yet, somehow, the stereotype of the Muslim terrorist lives on. Why? Because differences in how violence by Muslims is represented tilts the scales. This ensures that the image of the Muslim terrorist persists, in spite of reality. And in the media, acts of violence committed by Muslims are covered disproportionately and differently. And in the law, Muslims are more likely to be charged and convicted of terrorism and receive higher sentences, even when they haven't actually committed any acts of violence. Muslim violence is also represented as having a different root cause than non-Muslim violence. Consider the differing treatment of two otherwise similar attacks. Rehab Dugmash, a Muslim woman, waved a golf club and a knife around in a Canadian Tire, causing no serious injuries, but she was convicted of 4 counts of terrorism and sentenced to 7 years in prison as an ISIS supporter, despite being diagnosed with schizophrenia. Contrast that with the case of Mark Phillips, who attacked an immigrant family with a baseball bat because he mistook them for Muslims, calling them ISIS. Phillips broke the father's ribs, but he was given a conditional discharge and spent no time in prison because his attack was chalked up to marijuana-induced psychosis. In other words, the default assumption when Muslims commit violence is that they are agents of a global terrorist movement. When it's non-Muslims, however, we dismiss violent acts as resulting from individual psychological issues. When Muslims commit violence, these acts are considered to be part of a larger pattern, even when they happen in entirely different contexts, so that the murder of Coptic Christians in Egypt, for example, is portrayed as part of the same phenomenon as a suicide bombing at a pop concert in England. Incidents of white supremacist violence, on the other hand, are treated as isolated events. For example, after a deadly attack on a mosque in England, a security expert on CBC News said that a similar attack was unlikely to happen in Canada, even though the Quebec mosque shooting had happened just a few months before. Ironically, the war on terror has taken many times more civilian lives than has so-called terrorism itself. And yet, terrorism receives much more public attention and condemnation. This obscures the reality. Around the world, a greater proportion of political violence is actually perpetrated by Western states, rather than Muslim individuals or groups. If Muslims in the West are overrepresented in anything, it's in being doctors. And yet, the stereotype that sticks about Muslims is that of the terrorist. This myth that Muslims are violent enables violence against Muslims and others. This occurs at the interpersonal level, with the Quebec mosque shooting, the 100-plus active white supremacist groups across the country, including ones that are lethally armed, and regular anti-Muslim hate crimes and protests. And it also occurs at the state level, globally in a devastating war on terror, and domestically in draconian counter-terrorism measures that have also been used to target Indigenous land and water protectors, environmentalists, and other dissenters. In Canada and the US, a person is actually far more likely to be killed for being Muslim than by a Muslim so-called terrorist. But the biased representation of Muslims ensures that most believe the exact opposite to be true.